Sarah, Plain and Tall, Chapter 5. The sheep made Sarah smile. She sank her fingers into their thick, coarse wool. She talked to them, running with the lambs, letting them suck on her fingers. She named them after her favorite aunts, Harriet and Mattie and Lou. She lay down in the field beside them and sang Sumer is a coomin' in, her voice drifting over the meadow grasses, carried by the wind. She cried when we found a lamb that had died, and she shouted and shook her fist at the turkey buzzards that came from nowhere to eat it. She would not let Caleb or me come near, and that night Papa went with a shovel to bury the sheep and a lantern to bring Sarah back. She sat on the porch alone. Nick crept up to lean against her knees. After dinner, Sarah drew pictures to send home to Maine. She began a charcoal drawing of the fields, rolling like the sea rolled. She drew a sheep whose ears were too big, and she drew a windmill. "Windmill was my first word," said Caleb. "Papa told me so." "Mine was flower," I said. "What was yours, Sarah?" "Dune," said Sarah. "Dune?" Caleb looked up. "In Maine," said Sarah, "there are rock cliffs that rise up at the edge of the sea, and there are hills covered with pine and spruce trees, green with needles. But William and I found a sand dune all our own. It was soft and sparkling with bits of mica, and when we were little, we would slide down the dune into the water." Caleb looked out the window. "We have no dunes here," he said. Papa stood up. "Yes, we do," he said. He took the lantern and went out the door to the barn. "We do?" Caleb called after him. He ran ahead, Sarah and I following, the dogs close behind. Next to the barn was Papa's mound of hay for bedding. Nearly as tall as the barn, covered with canvas to keep the rain from rotting it. Papa carried the wooden ladder from the barn and leaned it against the hay. "There," he smiled at Sarah, "our dune." Sarah was very quiet. The dogs looked up at her, waiting. Seal brushed against her legs, her tail in the air. Caleb reached over and took her hand. "It looks high up," he said. "Are you scared, Sarah?" "Scared?" "Scared!" exclaimed Sarah. "You bet I'm not scared." She climbed the ladder, and Nick began to bark. She climbed to the very top of the hay and sat, looking down at us. Above, the stars were coming out. Papa piled a bed of loose hay below his pitchfork. The light of the lantern made his eyes shine when he smiled up at Sarah. "Fine?" called Papa. "Fine," said Sarah. She lifted her arms over her head and slid down, down into the soft hay. She lay, laughing as the dogs rolled beside her. "Was it a good dune?" called Caleb. "Yes," said Sarah. "It is a fine dune." Caleb and I climbed up and slid down, and Sarah did it 3 more times. At last, Papa slid down too, as the sky grew darker and the stars blinked like fireflies. We were covered with hay and dust, and we sneezed. In the kitchen, Caleb and I washed in the big wooden tub, and Sarah drew more pictures to send to William. One was of Papa, his hair curly and full of hay. She drew Caleb sliding down the hay, his arms like Sarah's over his head. And she drew a picture of me in the tub, my hair long and straight and wet. She looked at her drawing of the fields for a long time. "Something is missing," she told Caleb. "Something." And she put it away. "Dear William," Sarah read to us by lantern light that night, "sliding down our dune of hay is almost as fine as sliding down the sand dunes into the sea." Caleb smiled at me across the table. He said nothing, but his mouth formed the words I had heard too. "Our dune."